and rested with his ancestors. They buried him in the tomb that he had cut out for himself in the city of David. They laid him on a bier covered with spices and various blended perfumes, and they made a huge fire in his honor. King Asa was one of the longest reigning kings in Judah. But so let's ask the question, who said these words? The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth. Who spoke those words and who did he speak it to? Welcome, Oswini. We're reading 2 Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, chapter 16, from verse 1 to 14. We're reading verse 9 now. Who spoke these words? Who wants to help us? And put up a hand and say, so-and-so was speaking. Was Peggy?
It was the prophets who spoke this words to King Asa.
What was his name? Verse 7.
Verse 7, they say that Hanani, yes.
Hanani, not a very well-known prophet. Not as well-known as Isaiah or Jeremiah. He appears only once in the whole of the Old Testament. And who was he speaking to?
To King Asa.
King Asa. And was he actually praising him in this little conversation they had?
No, he was not praising him. He was actually he was giving him a warning that because King Asa was not focused on pleasing God, he would be those who are not striving to please God will be punished.
All right. So thank you very much, Peggy. So now, what happened? The kingdom of Judah was being threatened by the kingdom of Israel. Remember, the people of God, the 12 tribes split into two. Israel was the northern kingdom and Judah was the southern kingdom. And so they were constantly at loggerheads and even at war. So the Israel, King Baasha was in charge. It was ruling Israel, and they came and built a big city at Ramah. And Ramah was just 13 kilometers north of Jerusalem. And he started building a huge city there, cutting off the trade routes from Jerusalem and Judah to the north. So they couldn't trade. They were being blockaded. They were being threatened by the people of Israel. And so what did Asa do to try to counter this threat, this economic and military threat from Israel? 2nd Chronicles chapter 16, for those who have joined late, verse 9, from verse 1 to verse 14 actually. So instead of trusting in God, Hanani says to Asa, instead of putting your trust in God as you did, so in chapter 14, if you can read the whole of Asa's life is chapter 14, 15, and 16. Please go and read it to get the big picture later. Instead of trusting in God as you did when the Cushites, the Ethiopians and the Libyans attacked you, and God helped you to overcome their threat. Instead of doing that, what did Asa do? In verse 2, 2nd Chronicles 16, verse 2, what did Asa do? Was Becky? Maybe you can put your hand down. Let's see if somebody else. What was the strategy of King Asa? No problem. What was Asa's strategy to counter this threat from Baasha and the kingdom of Israel? Chapter 16, verse 2. He took money, he took gold and silver. Yes, Brother Tigeri. What was his politics?
Yeah, I think he used his wealth now to buy safety, to buy security.
Mm.
Yeah, to run away from, to protect himself from his enemy.
And what did he use the money for? What did he use his wealth for?
He kind of like he paid this other king in order for him to protect him against King Basha.
Yeah, so he bribed the King Ben-Hadad from Aram. Now, Aram is where Syria is today. So here's Judah in the south. They're being pushed from the north by Israel. So he goes behind their backs and negotiates with the people behind the back of Israel to say, well, if you will attack them from behind and we can attack them from the front, then they will stop threatening us. They will stop blockading us. Then we will be free. So there's a bribe. And where did he take the bribe from? Where did the gold and the silver come from? Two places, the temple and his own palace. So his own storeroom, but also the gold and silver objects to worship God. The treasure, God's treasure, he uses that to bribe the king of Aram, who was not within God's covenant. This was an outsider to fight this inside fight against the Israelites, the people of Israel, the other tribes within God's covenant. So that's quite treasonous, you could say, in terms of faith. And so Hanani comes to him and says, that was foolish. That was foolish to use God's treasure to buy an ally outside of God's covenant to fight somebody inside of God's covenant. That was foolish, he says. So from now on, you're going to have war. If you had trusted God as you did when the Cushites and the Libyans attacked you, God protected you. You didn't look for help with the Egyptians or with the Syrians or with anyone else. You trusted God. You went into battle to defend, and God helped you to push away the Cushites, the threat. The Cushites were the Ethiopians, so it was an African attack. Egypt was often ruled by black Nubian and Ethiopian pharaohs and rulers. So there was this a group of African nations coming north and attacking Israel. And God protected them because Asa, at that time, in the beginning of his reign, trusted God. Now, later on in his life, he made schemes to try to make sure that he doesn't lose his life, and instead of trusting God. And the prophet comes and exposes him and says, King Asa, with all due respect, that was foolish. You've chosen the path of war. Now you're going to have war. And what did King Asa do? He was not amused. He was not at all impressed. He was terribly angry. He was furious and threw him into jail. The word for jail there means stocks, where you are put with your hands and your feet in wooden blocks so you can't move. So literally chained, you could even say into the torture chamber, for speaking the truth of God against the king who was no longer trusting in God, but trusting military alliances, political alliances to stay alive. The prophet gets hammered, gets thrown into jail. And then it says, he also started oppressing some of his people. Not because he was angry only, because he was angry at Hanani, but because he had gone off the rails, started oppressing, he started abusing his citizens, because something had got wrong in his relationship with God. He became an authoritarian ruler who doesn't take criticism and who oppresses his people. It often works like that, isn't it? If something goes wrong in our relationship with God, we start becoming cruel. We start becoming nasty to even to people very close to us. And then he got ill. He had the Bible says his feet, he had a serious sickness in his feet. Maybe, we don't know what it was, gout or maybe gangrene or something, but he died of it. But it worked, of course. It worked. His strategy in the beginning, he did avert the threat, but the price that he paid for it was huge, because then he had actually empowered the Arameans, and then they started becoming one of the big enemies of both Israel and Judah later in history. So when you make deals with your enemy to fight your brothers or your sisters, you're actually empowering the enemy. Hanani says God works differently. God's eyes look to those who don't get up to all sorts of tricks and political schemes, but to trust God completely. That's real power. That's real empowerment and strengthening. That's what God is looking out for. What God's eyes are searching the world for are men and women and children who would not live by schemes and strategies for power or for success or for wealth, who wouldn't waste their wealth on schemes to pay others, but who would be fully committed, whose hearts would be whole and together, waiting on God. All right, what does this mean for us today in our South African situation? We have faced with all sorts of threats. It's not the Northern Kingdom threatening us, building a city on our borders. It's COVID, the lockdown, the economy, where really we can't trade, we can't go in and out because of the lockdown. There's been serious looting and uprising and unrest, threatening not only our lives, but our livelihoods. How do we respond? What is this verse, this passage? What is the Prophet Hanani saying to us? How do we respond to this threat? Are we going to do the Asa route? What would the Asa route be? Trusting in the wrong allies. What would be a faithful response to the crisis we're facing, different crises we are facing? I've opened the platform. Who would like to say, what is this passage telling us about our response today to COVID, to the lockdown, and to the loot down that we've had? Who would like to, somebody who hasn't spoken yet, please put up your hand and tell us what God is telling you for your life tonight. Who would like to start? What does this mean practically? If we are not going to do what Asa did, if we're going to follow Hanani's advice, if we're not going to be foolish like King Asa, what would we do? What should we do? Fukase, would you like to start? Is there anything that comes to mind? Show that our hearts are fully committed, fully trusting in God, and not in other schemes or other allies or other tricks. Alta?
I think it is to keep our eyes on God. He's looking at us, but look up in response to him looking at us and trusting him completely, even though things may go wrong. But that is our strength, because if we can go through this thing, all the things that are threatening us or that's happening in our country that makes us disappointed and sad and, yeah, just frustrated also, to keep on trusting God, because that's our strength. We cannot be weak now. And we can only be strong in God. I think that to me is the message for me. I don't know.
Thank you, Doctor. Someone else? How is this verse relevant, this whole passage? The clash between Hanani and King Asa. Who would like to say something? Yes, it's Rosetta.
Thank you, Prof. For me, it is giving counsel in the sense that the prophet is the messenger of God, and God is seeing that I'm not positioned to actually abide by him as he is looking at me through and through. So instead of looking to God, as Danny had said, instead of fixing my eyes on God, I'm fixing my eyes on things that I do not have control of, and all things are made by God, and all things succumb to the power of God. So for me to be strong, for me to get through the things that I'm going through, I need to fix my eyes on him and trust him entirely, that whether things are good or bad, they do not change who God is to me. He is my Father, he is my provider, my healer, my comforter, my everything. So I need to fix my eyes on God in the midst of the looting, the killing, and the panic, as well as the sicknesses and all the troubles that the world is seeing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I want to pick up two things you said. We mustn't look only at the problem. We can stare ourselves blind at this city of Rama that's being built on our doorstep. We can admire the problem, as some people say. We can be so busy analyzing what caused it, what's the problem, what's wrong, that we take our eyes off God. We can also look in the wrong direction by looking at Ben-Hadad, let's say a foreign ally, trusting in the wrong advice, in conspiracy theories, in scaremongers, political opportunists who want to make mileage out of the unrest and the poverty. And instead, we should look at God. Brother Tefedi, what does that mean? Do you want to add, thicken this conversation for us?
Yes, I think he also provide kind of like an answer. And if you look at verse 8,
yeah,
and he says, "Don't you remember what happened to the Ethiopians and the Libyans?"
Mm-hmm.
Which means, don't you remember what God did for you? You've
Mm.
been in these kind of problems before. You fought the wars, and God did deliver you from the Ethiopians and the Libyans. which simply means he did deliver you from those challenges, those problems, those enemies that you are facing. I think you should go there to that one who did deliver you from those challenges that you faced before. So I think as much as he's rebuking him, he's giving him the answer to his problem, to his difficulties. And I think it's also relevant to us that God, we did face the Ethiopians, we did face the Libyans, we did face this kind of problems before, and we need to go back to God.
Thank you very much. That's precious. You see, memory is extremely important. We, in a sense, we can only look to God, to God's looking at us when we look back, when we remember what God has done for us, in us, through us, in the past, and trust and know that God is faithful, that God is the same yesterday and today and forever. God has brought us through all sorts of difficulties as individuals, as families, as a country, as a continent, as a world. And faith means to remember God's faithfulness. Thank you. That's really precious. That adds to the picture. Anyone else? What does this passage help us? How does it help us to be Christians today in the situation that we're in? Yes, as Peggy.
It helps us to be Christians today in the situations that we are in, Prof. Maybe expanding on what Brother Tikedi just said, that by relying on God in the difficulties, through the difficulties that we are experiencing today, which we could equate to the wars that are referred to in verse 8, that as we know that the wars that we are fighting are also spiritual wars. So we need to keep relying on God, not fixing our eyes to God, to help us through the COVID situations that we are facing, to help us through all the challenges that our country is facing, the riots and others. And how, maybe the question also is, how can we do that? Do we just fix our eyes to God? But we also need to pray. We need to be, the other day we were talking about interceding. We need to be, as Christians, to be interceding for our country as it is going through all these challenges. We have that responsibility. And the other thing that comes to my mind is our conduct as Christians. We are human beings. We are also not perfect. But the issue of integrity also comes to my mind, that if we behave, the definition that is sometimes used of integrity is behaving in a way that even when you are alone, behaving in a way that you would behave when other people are watching, So as we need to be exemplary, we need to be true to ourselves in the same way that we would want to be true to God. We need to, and in the instance of the COVID situation, we need to abide to the rules. We need to comply with the regulations, for instance. And sometimes it will be out of our control that we get infected, despite trying to do the right thing. But even then, we need to comply, we need to isolate, we need to do what is right. And in the instance of situations like the riots, we, over and above praying for all the challenges, we need to stick to the truth, to do what is right, to also, when our fellow brothers do what is wrong, to show them that this is wrong, to speak out about what is not right and what is not just. And we have that responsibility. I believe that we have that responsibilities as believers in Christ, to stand for the truth. And through our actions, the people will see the truth and they will see the greatness of God, because we will be over and above interceding. We'll also be showing with our actions what is true, what is just, and what is right.
Thank you. Before I ask Nomvuyo, let me just say, you see, what King Asa did was a short-term solution. It worked. He probably felt very satisfied with himself, sitting in his palace in the sunshine and having a feast with his family. We've averted the problem. We've got rid of the challenge. And then Hanani came and spoiled his party by saying to him, what you've done is you haven't got to the root of the problem. So I think when we respond to the unrest and the looting, we have to say there were obviously instigators, but there are millions of hungry people in the country who, if there is a shop where you can find some free bread or whatever it is, I'll go and take free bread because I'm hungry. So we mustn't take shortcuts and superficial solutions. We need to ask, what are the real underlying causes that has created this explosion? Apart from the instigators, apart from opportunists, there are genuinely hungry children and women and men in this country. And how are we can win one battle, but we lose the whole war. So how does God look at us? How do we get strengthened by God's eyes to do what is just, to try and overcome the root causes of many of our problems? Nomvuyo, over to you.
Thank you so much. The uncomfortable truth about what we have just read now from the story, I've learned a few really important lessons about what we actually need and why God is essential to each of our lives. Some people, not all, who have an abundance of wealth, they get to the point where they don't really feel like they need anybody, especially God. Their perceived need for others becomes very numb, even though it still exists. Others, they thrive to live good lives, where else there are other people out there who are really struggling, helping others and generally being decent people. They try not to hurt others and they minimize the damage that they can cause. The truth is, Prof, we all need some things, including God, in our lives, as difficult as it can sometimes. That might just be because they are in our blind spots. When things happen that it's outside of our control, like the looting that happened for the past week, our sisters and brothers, they lost their jobs, and during the COVID, everything it is just down the hill. Even when we reach to a point when we realize we are not powerful enough to change our own negative behaviors, we suddenly become more aware of our need of God when we are in crisis, which is the more cause of the things become. And we also become more nearly aware of our need for God when inevitably we face our own death, something each of us will have to do someday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, somebody asked what passage are we reading? It's 2 Chronicles in the Old Testament, chapter 16, mainly verse 9, but we were reading the whole chapter. Yes, Nomvuyo, when you talked, I suddenly remembered, you see, Asa had gold and silver in his palace, and he even took money from the temple, golden objects from the temple. The question is, what do we do with our wealth? Those of us who are relatively better off than millions of other people, what do we spend it on? Asa spent it on an alliance, on bribing to get support from an outsider to fight his local battles, you could almost say. What do we use our money for? That's a very important challenge. If we want to be empowered by God, if we want our hearts to be fully dedicated and committed to God, to God's plan, God's kingdom, God's will, what does it mean for the way we spend our wealth that we have in our palace or in the temple? But yes, our need for God has been so much highlighted in this crisis. Eh? Someone else. Thank you. It's wonderful, precious contribution that are coming in. Anyone else? We're almost at 8 o'clock, so maybe we can say one more contribution and then we'll go to intercession. We don't want to spend more than an hour in total. We all have other things to do as well with our families and our children. One final contribution about the relevance of this passage for our lives today. Maybe just one thing. If you read chapters 14, 15, and 16, all three, you see that how Asa was praised in the first phase of his career. He really did God's will. He was a good king. And then this crisis of Baasha and building Ramah changed him. And the last years of his life was downhill in terms of his commitment to God. So even when he was seriously ill, it says he didn't consult God, he consulted only the doctors. Now, it's not wrong to consult doctors and to trust vaccines, for example. But if you only consult the doctors and not trust God, it reveals something about your spirituality, about your life. And how it is that sometimes as Christians, we have a deep commitment to God when we're younger, and then we lose it when we get older. That's what happened to Asa. It's a real challenge for us who are slightly older. Do we keep on growing, or do we reach a peak and then we start sliding down? Something that just occurred to me while Nomvuyo was talking. One final comment before we do intercession. I really want, all right, let's close it here then. I want to really encourage you to read those 3 chapters, 2 Chronicles 14, 15, and 16, the whole life of King Asa as described in Chronicles, and how God speaks to us today through the way he lived, his goodness, but then also his mistakes that the prophet Hanani exposed and unmasked, to call him back to a full trust in God. Brother Fukasi, you're going to lead the intercession, so over to you.
Thank you, Prof. I think it's only proper for me to start by saying thank you. Indeed, we have learned a lot. Let us all pray. Dadaruna ya mahutimong wena musisi waruna bohle Modimo wa rona re mo bokang ka mehla yohle. Lord, we want to thank you this evening for the wonderful word. And it's through the word that today or this evening we are empowered. Jwalo ka ho Modimo wa rona ho bohlokwa hore re qolle me re tle ho wena ka boikokobetso. Modimo wa rona ho bohlokwa hore nakong ena re tle ho wena Modimo wa rona jwalo ka batho ba hao. Modimo wa rona ka ho qolla re tlisa ho wena lelapa Modimo la ha maphike konyana lehodimo. Re kopa Modimo wa rona nakong ena o ba etele ebe bo metshedisi ka hare ho lelapa. Modimo wa rona nakong ena re dumelle re atumetse batho bohle ba kulang malapeng a bona, haholoholo di-membera tsohle tsa Melodi ya Tshwane. Ra ba atumetsa ho wena ntata rona re a o kopa Modimo wa rona o re o be le bona o ba fe matla a matjha Modimo hore hohle moo ba iphumanang ba le teng ba sena matla Modimo wa rona ba kgone ho ema e be ba phethe tsohle tseo ba di etsang lefatsheng la ka kwano. Wa lokela ntata rona hore re ikatumetse le rona bohle hobane nakong ena Modimo wa rona re iphumana ka hare ho maemo a sa tlwaelehang. Kokwanahloko ena Modimo wa rona ye re ntse re leka ho e lwantsha iphile matla. Jwalo ka ho Modimo wa rona re a o kopa re fe bohlale ba hore ka mehla le mehla Modimo wa rona re lwantshe kokwanahloko ena ebe re itshireletse Modimo wa rona. Metsena tsohle konyana lehodimo wa lokela hore re di kope mabitsong a mararo a bokang ka mehla yohle. Amen.
Amen.
Re nka moela mohau wa morena rona Jesu Kriste, lerato la Modimo wa rona le kopano ya ka mehla yohle e be le rona ho tloha hona jwale ho fihlella re ba re boela re bona Modimo le Jesu Kriste. Amen.
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 Thank you, brothers and sisters. Sleep well and stay safe. God bless you.
Good night, everyone.